So fluently 4, and how many other women? 3 more. Yeah. And I bet you can speak those 3 better than some of us can speak English here. But anyway, yeah. And you had a brilliant job in Berlin before you came. Settled in. It was a really important job,
I spent 6 years in Berlin, and the last 2 or 3 hours, they had a program in an Institute for Research. It was called the Institute for Advanced Study, where we invited scientists, life scientists, to spend time with people from the humanities, artists, and social sciences, so immersed in this interdisciplinary environment with no agenda. They could come with a project of their own choice. The only obligation was to actually have lunch at meals with the other colleagues and produce something that was out of the ordinary.
So why did you leave such a brilliant setup for the grey, rainy hills of Dún Laoghaire?
I wanted to change, and I thought that Ireland matched my disposition better after their experience.
Well, some of us we are referred to as Northern European Mediterranean types.
That's right, yes.
Climatised to rain and fog and greyness and so on. But, okay, on to the book though. It's a strange hybrid book, Giovanni. I think its broad gesture is mainly didactic, but it is a work of short stories. It's hybrid insofar as you used a short story, an exploration of character to educate us on different dynamics in intimate relationships. But what's innovative about it, I suppose, is that you have a sort of an essayistic digression in the middle of each story to explain the neuroscience explanation for what's happening in the relationship. So how did you come across this particular form? How did you devise it?
Well, I don't know why I'm here, in fact, the short story festival. But thank you very much. I'm delighted and honored. But I was interested in the subject of intimacy and love in general. My first book ends with a chapter on love, and I really wanted to find out what intimacy is for myself and for hopefully for someone else who might be willing to read it. So how could I do this? I've got a background in science, and of course, even if the experimentation in the science of love is not that much, we don't know a lot about it. It's there, and I was aware of it. But I said, how can I deliver this material? In fact, science is could be a dry way. We're all different. We all experience intimacy differently, with lovers, with family, with friends. So I thought that stories and bring out characters who feel strong emotions and have something to solve, something to understand for themselves in different contexts, was a way to mix the two worlds in a way. So each chapter really starts as a story. So I narrate what these characters do, what they want, what they need to understand, but I intersperse the science, hopefully without too stark of an interruption. And the science echoes what the narration has just delivered. So that's the way it goes back and forth.
Yeah. Well, how we're going to structure this event is we just talk a little bit at first about the book as a construct, the book as an entity that's received by an audience, and then we'll have you read one of the stories, and then we'll go into more nitty-gritty about the subject matter that's explored in the book. But again, you said, what am I doing at this festival? Somebody sent this directly to me by name, artistic director of the Short Story Festival, and I worked in the book trade. So I looked at the spine of Piatkus. I said, why the fuck is somebody sending me like this? Because they're so well known as publishers of self-help books, and even spirituality, alternative type, that sort. So I haven't had a kind of amateur interest in neurology over the years anyhow, so I started the book, and I said, yeah, this is interesting, okay. Strange, yeah, this could be an interesting, different event at the festival. When I fired off the invitation to, I'd only read the first three or four stories. I didn't know at all you were gay. As I progressed through the book, I said, God, everybody in this book is straight. This man know we're living in like 2017 Ireland, what are we gonna like? Yeah. And then before I continued reading this book right through the post, and yeah, from you're gay, and you do in fact deal with gay relations as well. So, but you have come across a strange reaction from some readers to how you present gay characters. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Well, yes, it is an interesting thing. It came entirely natural to me this day and age to talk about straight relationships and gay relationships. You know, there are LGBT characters in the book. I think it's fairly split.
It is, yeah.
And it was entirely normal to me. And I thought, well, I might know a little bit more about gay relationships, but I'll give it a shot anyway in both cases. And because I didn't want to exclude anybody in that way. But I found it interesting that I was concerned myself that it was perhaps putting those relationships on an equal level in a way that I hoped was the most natural way might be regarded as something strange, because perhaps because of a lot of some oppression before, it was, you had gay literature and non-gay literature, and I think these are boundaries that we can trespass.
How I read it is that, in the history of gay characters portrayed in art, they're often portrayed as curios, as eccentrics, or whatever. I mean, your gay characters are just like all your other straight characters, and the relationship dynamics that you illustrate within the gay relationships are, I think, probably, pertaining to other kinds of relationships,
yes.
Straight and transgender and all the rest of it.
Well, I would say, for instance, there's a story in a book called Equal, which is set against the background of the marriage equality referendum in Ireland. This is a West Cork story, by the way. So it's played here. And I played with that, with the concept of equality, not just because, Led and Fionn, who are the protagonists, are, treated equally, but there can be inequality within a relationship. And that equality in that relationship can be between a man and a woman, between two women, or between two men, Sometimes we may feel inadequate in a relationship. We need to grow emotionally in order to love ourselves and the other person too. So equality meant a lot to me in that chapter, and that's the way I played with it. Yeah.
Okay, so let's hear a story from you, and then afterwards we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the issue.
Oh, okay, yes, sure, gladly. So I'll just say a few words about what type of characters we have here. So the book is called Together, Closest Stories of Intimacy in Friendship, Love and Family. So most of the stories are about romantic, relationships, but there are I also have stories between parents and their children. I start with a woman who's looking for a boyfriend, and then I talk about betrayal. I talk about how some couples can find themselves caught in a chase of attraction and rejection. And I talk about a daughter who's saying goodbye to her dying father. And I also talk about friends. So the story that I decided to read for you tonight is about two inseparable friends who have a special relationship, and they are in America in the 70s and 80s. And it's called Yes. It feels like he's here, watching. I could turn around and see him in bed, leaning on one elbow, asking me why the hell I can never sleep, if I know Jack Spicer's poem about one-night stands, and whether I could rub his back. He knows he gave me a hard assignment. I wonder, did I take it too seriously, or did I fail to fulfill it? You must be home by now, Anthony, unaware of what you have unearthed. Not 1 week since I heard you whistle, and I'm simply a wonder our paths crossed. Through you, Morris has vigorously re-emerged from wherever he was to remind me of what he and I decided our lives were going to be. Don't be upset that I ran away earlier. I was overwhelmed by your resemblance to him. It is time I told you about him, as it seemed to me the two of you entertained some secret relationship. Tonight, your eyes look almost like his. You are fairer, his hands were larger, your neck is slightly wider, but hair whispers the same way when you're around, as though something were about to be revealed. And the smile, the unwavering curl on the lips, and the eyes filling when you're about to laugh, these seem to have traveled straight from his face and landed comfortably on yours. I wrapped my legs around you in a body signature that was ours, Morris's and mine. I have to remember to avoid your knees because you're not him after all. He was exquisitely sensitive on his calves, and to I used to trace them with my shin. If he really were here now, he would touch the back of my neck, bury his nose in my hair, kiss my forehead. "It's all right, Margot, it's all right," he would say. "Together we figured out how to live. Don't you remember that?" If neither of us had brought anyone home, we would spend the night together. He would emerge from his room in the basement and slip into our big bed upstairs without saying a word, sometimes humming a tune. And then he would start, a soft murmuring on the day just gone. I would ask him things like, "Was it hard to better the world today?" And he would say, "It was enough to step outside and show up there." It was our lullaby. In the middle of it, he would pull me aside and ask, looking me straight in the eyes, what was wrong with all the lovers in town who didn't know I existed. But then, with a tinge of fear in his eyes, he would ask, "You're not letting anyone take my place, though, are you?" As he nosed my cheeks with his eyes closed. "No, no one takes anyone's place here," I would reassure him. "This is fair as heaven. There's plenty for everyone." This is what bedtime used to be at our place, especially after our promise. Margot first saw Morris's deep black eyes at a party. "What's your passion?" Morris asked her. With this opening line, Morris tried to glimpse everyone's true desires. He wanted to know what kept him alive. He counted the seconds until he got an answer. If he had to wait long, or if the answer was evasive, he would move on to the next target in search of better enticement. "Sex, nothing else," was Margot's reply. She exaggerated. In fact, her sexual world developed only after meeting Morris, but she knew he would like such an answer. "What's yours then?" she challenged him. "To help others find and express theirs," Morris replied. They walked to the sea and talked until the morning seagulls returned from the horizon. He then carried Margot all the way to her room. He had powerful, supple hands with large, rounded knuckles, the fingers long, in agreement with his ability to discriminate detail. As he said goodbye, he shouted, "I think I have a new passion, Margot." He ended on the O, as if he were blowing a kiss. They moved in together 3 weeks later, on a bright October afternoon. On the avenue, the trees bowed with delight as they drove with the loaded truck toward their new little home. People mistook them for brother and sister, perhaps because they perceived in them the same desire to leave their families behind. Morris was born in the back of his family car, somewhere along Highway 1, as his parents drove back from a trip to the woods. As a child, he thought he had invented the word cuddle and went around showing everyone what it meant, something he still did when Margot met him. When he arrived in town, he had given up a prestigious fellowship in law to devote himself to studying literature. His strict immigrant Greek parents refused to speak to him after he left home. Both Margot and Morris had jobs, but money never abounded. Morris worked as a cashier in a supermarket 5 blocks away from where they lived. He was there mostly during the afternoons, and his earnings were just enough to pay the rent and keep a bottle of gin and cigarettes at home. Margot worked in a flower shop. On her free mornings, when she didn't have to rise that early, he would crawl out of bed and go to their big kitchen, where she would brew him coffee while he did push-ups. And then it was time for a smoke. Margot didn't smoke before she met Morris, and he put it like this: "You're teaching me how to live, I'm teaching you how to die." They had a large chalkboard in the kitchen, and they never used it to draw up their shopping list. Morris would sketch a little something on it or scribble a clue referring to a poem or story he had read. He loved to keep her guessing. He left a question mark and some space for her to write the title. Otherwise, one would start a big picture in colored chalk. The other would add, erase, alter, back and forth. A rooster meant a boy was in the house. A sailboat that they were going out. A half moon meant a quiet night for just the two of them. And a cloud signaled those rare moments when one of them needed to be left alone. Margot listened to music when she went to bed. This habit started with Morris, but he went back to her childhood. She lived in a big house. One of her uncles lived there too. When she was little, she had a room to herself, and her uncle liked to watch TV until late. If she could hear the television, she knew he was occupied and he was safe to sleep. She taught herself to wake whenever the sound from downstairs stopped. Silence at night meant trouble was making its slow way up to her room. One night, in the house she shared with Morris, Margot couldn't sleep. Although she was absolutely still, Morris was aware of her being up. He pretended to sleep deeply. Margot was beside him, watching him, when he suddenly opened one eye. "You can't fool me. You haven't slept a wink." And then he tried. "What do you hear?" "Silence, Morris. I hear silence." "And that's what scares you? What if I snored?" He went downstairs and turned on the radio in the kitchen. Then he came back and snuggled up against her while she drifted off to sleep. Ever since that night, falling asleep to the sound of something was for Margot like being held in Morris's arms. On the inside of their door, they had a brass plate that read NMBS for No More Bullshit. A 4-letter slogan to reassure each other they had a plan. Partly an invitation to break with the past, it worked as a daily reminder to do all they could to be happy. They made it a point to keep vivid in their minds what their life goals were and what they entailed. The NMBS regimen also had to do with their hearts. It was mostly about defending love. It helped them turn away from those they liked but who didn't return their feelings, and from those who, for one reason or another, were resistant to love. "No civilians in our kingdom," they said to each other. Morris was convinced that love takes the form that works best to all people if people allow it. One particular reason why a lot of people were fascinated with Morris and sheltered under the arm of his company was his ability to help them understand what they wanted. He showed a captivating complicity with every detail about them. Although he was often cheeky, Morris was not arrogant. He understood that individuals are irreplaceable, and so he just encouraged them to be honest with themselves, without letting them feel ordinary when they couldn't. And that's why people kept coming to him. Over time, Morris and Margot became good at surrounding themselves with those who thought like them, and they learned how to trust their gut feelings when choosing them. There were no half intentions. If they said yes, it was yes, with all of themselves. On a hot, midsummer Saturday morning, knocked out by the heat, they remained silent in bed longer than usual. Neither of them had to work. And then Morris got up and shouted, "Sweetie, we're having a party tonight." He asked Margot to take care of the food while he ran around to invite everyone they knew. He instructed their friend Nick to buy booze and prepare sangria. He came back carrying baskets full of flowers, and they started to decorate the porch with red candles. Margot kept dropping things and not paying the right kind of attention to his enthusiasm. "I know what it is. It's that boy with a woman's face and skin like cavalry. I've read the lines I've been writing for him. What's his name?" "Stephen," said Margot, and he's got warm, talking eyes, colored like river water. "I think he's one of us." Margot had audaciously sent poems and flowers to a boy called Stephen, who visited the flower shop regularly, but she had failed to find the courage to sign them or leave her number. The party seemed the right excuse to show him her world, but she hesitated to invite him because she assumed he would say no. Even if in their realm of affections the larger order counted more, being drawn to a particular individual and depending on their reciprocity did matter, and Morris had only one way of dealing with it. Babe, you'll break many hearts if you insist on protecting only yours, and refuse to believe there might be a fragile one on the other side of your efforts. NMBS. Please be happy, Margot. Please invite the boy to the party. And when he shows up, just don't forget to ask him about his passion. This was one of the numerous simple occasions on which Morris helped Margot feel alive and brave, as though he was flying her to the other side of the moon. Margot did invite Stephen, and while she hoped he would come, having found the courage to invite him was enough. The guests arrived all together, a swarm of noisy, relentlessly lively and refreshing creatures Morris and Margot had drawn to themselves. Hearts holding hands, lives seeking more life. Nick took care of the music, and they all danced. Stephen arrived, thanking Margot for the poems and saying he wished she had signed the first one she had sent him. Morris watched them talk from one corner of the room, and before leaving, Stephen asked Margot on a date for the following Saturday. She winked at Nick, who put on Morris' favorite song. Margot pulled Morris by the arm and danced with him to remind him they were at the core. Right there, in the middle of their living room, they felt at the center of the world, a world she and Morris had created. The party ended almost without them realizing. They sat on the porch amid the candle lights. Come on, the party can't end just yet. Follow me. And they ran to the pier, laughing and screaming until they collapsed on the sand. Margot took Morris's hands, inviting him to look at the horizon. He leaned closer with the light clinging to his mouth and raised his eyes toward hers with a smile that embraced her, the ocean, and the entire sky. His forehead radiated calm, and the chin was tilted just so to manifest rebelliousness she hoped to never fade. Beauty, he said softly, I want us to trust in the power of siding with life and all its most inconvenient forms of expansiveness. Let's welcome vulnerability and believe it's possible for people to find each other. Everything else is detail. Let's promise each other we won't give up. It was a perfect summer night with an uncountable number of stars that seemed to have stopped twinkling in order to listen. There was almost no breeze and the gentlest of swells. They could only hear the sea and, in the distance, whales singing to each other. Yes, Morris, I promise you. As dawn diffused across the violet sky, Morris carried her home, like on the night they first met. He put her to bed with a long kiss on her forehead. Margot held his gaze without saying a word. Morris covered her eyes with his hands and didn't move until she was deeply asleep. Before lying down next to her, he turned the radio on. Morris had begun writing a novel in which he wanted to infuse all his theories on love when Margot noticed unusual skin lesions on his back as he took a shower. Before, there had been a wild fever that made him cough and sweat at night and didn't vanish for days. It was the beast. Around that time, the three demographic categories most affected were gay men, junkies, and Haitians. Morris made a joke. What's the hardest thing about telling your mother you have AIDS? Convincing her you're Asian. The new winter arrived, and Morris intensified the pace of his writing. They pretended things were normal. The jokes didn't stop, neither did the drawing on the board. They had fewer parties, but always a house full of friends. They hummed and sang in the shower. The whispering at night deepened. Unfortunately, Morris's condition did not cease to worsen. One morning, he was rushed to the hospital while Margot wasn't at work. Nick found him unconscious and shivering at the desk. Nick called the flower shop, and Margot ran home. It took the most out of her during those fragile moments to be absolutely firm about convincing Morris he didn't need to stick around to keep her company. He could barely talk, but he said, "Remember what we decided, sweetie. Use your fine emotions to build a world where there's time and room enough for poetry, where everyone can breathe." Margot nodded and embraced him with the whole of herself, and then he could leave. She held him until they took him away from her. Back home from the hospital, she poured herself a glass of gin, lit a cigarette, and sat at the desk. Their moon shone in the kitchen. He had taken out a picture of himself as a child, playing with a kite on the shore. His papers were there, The front sheet, a poem. Where have you been all this time? You show up now, the ungracious twist in my last joke. You let me plot verse onto the day, shape hope, now you make it eat it all up until I choke. Gossip has it, things blossom at the tip of life. I don't know why, that tip is every day, live or die. Who's to tell me it wasn't all a big lie? Shut up, I don't believe you. And anyway, it's done. If it is true, tell no one. A poem broken in the making, like his life, just when he had begun to unfold more or less the way he wanted. Nick was the second to bow out. Stephen and half a dozen of those who were at the party are dead too. And Margot doesn't know how she didn't get it. Keeping the promise was not always simple. Morris didn't live enough to struggle with any temptation to give up. And many times Margot felt alone and fragile, on the verge of yielding. She forced herself to always look for meaning, for closeness, for truthfulness, and for compassion, and refused to expect less of life. And MBS. She understood it was imperative to aim high in the accomplishment of one's intimate life. Over the years, Margot noticed, especially among the young, that people became more and more disenchanted with love, and more afraid of discovering it and letting themselves go. But she needed to keep the promise. That way, she would continue to be surrounded by other like-hearted beings and also be of inspiration to those who didn't have the same experience but maybe needed guidance. The yearning for truth became a gift, not a curse. What else is there to do? Being generous in the world of intimacy is risky but ultimately rewarding. And she went for the rewards. Margot guesses it was just a gift straight from fairy's heaven that Anthony sat beside her on a bench and leaned against her with a cheeky smile. She knew she could be herself with Anthony. No one had ever made her safe enough for his long sleep after Morris. Margot climbs into bed and remembers what it was like to sleep close to Morris's breath, with his legs wrapped around her when he spooned at her. She hears the notes of his murmuring and is reminded of their plan. If she pays careful attention with her eyes closed, she can hear Morris humming his opinion on her current world. Morris would approve of Anthony thoroughly, and he wouldn't be jealous. He would rush Margot to invite him over for gin and cigarettes, and let him be the one she tells her day to. What else are you going to do, babe? He's one of us. If someone so rare like this young man appears in your life, you can only say yes. And when we say yes, we mean it, right? You're right, Morris. Damn right, says Margot. There's nothing else to do but to say yes. I'm a fountain of sweat.
You're glowing, Giovanni. In this book, you point out that what is love was, in a particular year, the most Googled question.
That's right.
And your response, not exactly in the same paragraph, but later on somewhere, is love is above all insanity. Now,
Yes, strong exaggeration.
now, a lot of the relationship dynamics dealt with in this book, they deal with asymmetrical relationships where one person is more committed or available than another. Situations where people think, perhaps, or believe they're open to relationships, but keep pursuing people who are unavailable.
Right, yes.
So why do people do that? How does it come about?
Love this. Where to start? Well, I think that this happens a lot, and I say that. Yeah, that's true. It happens a lot that we go perhaps for the wrong people, but I think that upstream is that we don't understand ourselves enough when we do this. And I compare love to insanity because there's sort of an acceleration, especially at the beginning, that makes us project, our feelings toward this person. Perhaps we don't know very, very well. But why do we keep doing this? Well, again, we need to understand ourselves first, and we have to understand how we deal with desire, with our desire. I always say that intimacy can exist between people, but it really starts with ourselves first. And so this sense of truthfulness that I evoke a lot is crucially important. We might go for the wrong people also because of the way we've learned how to love. And so these patterns recur. I talk about experiments that sort of echo this. No, we know that if you've ever been to a psychoanalyst, they will tell you over and over again, if you've received. This is a very loose and general distinction, so I don't want to make it sound too simple, but really we're neglected, we associate attachment and love to pain. And so we shun it, we're afraid of it, we don't go near it. Whereas if we've been loved and know that this can happen, this is beautiful, this is touching for us, we will know how to repeat that pattern. And I talk about experiments that I performed when I used to work in a lab, where we had mice that were taken care of by their mothers. And there were two types of mothers. There were some neglectful mothers who didn't spend a lot of time with them, and other type of mothers who in fact licked them, groomed and spent a lot of time with the mice. And if you test the mice as they grow up, those who are raised by neglectful mothers are more fearful in a variety of tests. And this is also passed on through generations. I know what you're thinking, fathers, what about dads? They're very important, and they don't figure in this particular experiment, but more and more is known about the role of fathers. I talk about it in Together Closer, a whole chapter about dads, and what happens in their brain, and what happens in the brain of mothers and stuff. But anyway, to summarize, I think really the way we can avoid making those mistakes is by becoming more aware. So it's important to observe ourselves. And so why are we doing this, and how are we doing this? In chapter 4, there's a relationship between two men who are clearly asymmetrical. One is clingy, the other one is avoidant. And the one who was clingy later on realizes what was going on, and says, this is the other person who is really an avoidant of attachment. And it takes him a long time to realize. And that's where I hope that people who read the book will associate the stories and that behavior to the science behind it, and say, well, this is how it happens. Well, I'm not going to behave the same way next time. I will spare myself the same pain that I have perpetrated all along.
But of course, in another place you say, one should be open to intimacy as long as there's not an intention to hurt. So it's not just about sparing yourself pain, but sparing other people pain as well.
Absolutely. Well, see, Morris and Margot were very young. They didn't know. They had no idea. Of course, they used big words and they said, well, we're learning how to love. Of course, they were young. They would probably make mistakes. It was very difficult for Margot later on in her life. And obviously, I'm sure she wasn't perfect all along. But I think is that it's better to make a few mistakes rather than have a closed heart. I think what is going on, that's why I said the story a few decades back, because I think that things have changed really. I wasn't alive then, but I've talked to people that age, and they tell me that things were slightly different. And I think that there's a lot more disenchantment now. And yes, if she's, well, I have no intention of hurting anybody, and of course I don't want anyone to hurt me. If this is clear when you approach a new person, and there's respect. Respect is a fundamental part of it. You need to respect yourself, who you are, know what you can offer in a relationship, and even if that's very little, to honor it. Respect for the other, because we're all on different paths. We all have different levels of emotional maturity. And I think also respect for the feeling of love itself. It's smarter than we are, and it's precious, so we not need to waste it. If someone special comes our way, I need to pay attention.
And in this book, you tell the story of someone special who came along when you were quite young yourself, the boy with the cello.
Big crush.
Yeah, big crush. You observed him. You observed him observing you. Felt head over heels in love with him, not even knowing him. You spent weeks scouring town trying to meet him again. You did meet him again.
Great thing.
You had a relationship. You had great fun. But then you realised you really know each other, and you weren't very compatible, and it broke up. but obviously it was a rewarding relationship in itself anyway. Yeah. What happens though when you get to the stage where you've done that 4 or 5 times? And the next person comes along and you feel exactly the same way. But you know the script. You know the script. You say, yes, we'll start this. And, yeah, you know, but he has this doomed way to start. And it's an asymmetrical relationship. Then you can say, okay, I can take responsibility for my own feelings here.
Right.
You know, if I get hurt, it's my own fault. But to knowingly get into a relationship where you know it may end badly and the other person may get hurt, is that responsible or ethical? To take that risk?
Well, okay, I think we need to ask ourselves, you know, how this is about worth, you know, how worth is this relationship really worth? And even if we tend to put the avoidant people, the people who perhaps don't respect us in a bad light, you know, I'm sure that no one is really a bad person, so we need to have compassion for who they are. And when I say, well, you know, perhaps there are so many other good things that will satisfy me. But it is also a matter of finding situations, contexts, and relationships that really reward us. So it's really a matter of habit. So we tend to do this because so far, these experiences have given us reward. It's strange, you know, we like pleasure as much as we like pain, you know. So that pain is rewarding for us. When we understand that, you know, really the pain is stronger than the pleasure, then we need to avoid it. And it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time and a lot of observation. So before we do something, before we say something, before we go somewhere, before we text anybody, we need to sort of think several times what we're doing. Is this identical action to what I did, you know, 2 years ago? And where did that lead? Well, I'll just take another path and see where, you know, where we're going. And so this is, I mean, it's crucially important, you know, the fact of being truthful to ourselves. And when I talk about the relationship between the two different styles of attachment, this very asymmetrical relationship, you know, there are studies in which people who tend to be the more clingy people learn how to deal with the more avoidant people, the people who are avoidant of attachment, the things they say, you know, the words they use. If they choose, they can put up with that and adjust their behavior, because it would be very difficult for the other to change, and just, you know, capitalize on the good parts of that person, then they can go along. Otherwise, you know, you can't square a circle. But
earlier when we were kind of having a casual chat over lunch, we talked about that age-old trope in neuroscience, the dichotomy between the mind and the brain, and, you know, the mind is the brain is the mind. But you were saying that for you the mind is more than the brain. The mind extends into the body.
yes.
And, you know, that makes sense in that if one feels stressed or even in love, one feels sensations in the chest, you know. So certainly the power of the mind extends beyond the brain, and that points out how absurd it is for these people who believe they can achieve immortality by downloading the data of their brain onto a computer. You know, one isn't quite. So tell us a little bit about the importance of touch.
Oh, yeah, no, it's absolutely. Well, the touch is important in intimacy. Yes, of course. But when I say that, you know, the mind is greater than the brain, this was, you know, crucial to me as I worked myself in a laboratory, and I had this experience of, you know, carrying out experiments, which after yesterday's talk we realized are similar to short stories. Every experience is a short story. I had to ask myself, but really, what is this information given me? Why are we concentrating on one organ and trying to map all emotions on this cortex and see where fear or guilt or joy is located in the brain? This is really useful for me. I think we are human beings, we are organisms that, and just not the brain, that we live intimately throughout all our bodies, and we live in an interaction with other people in the environment. But there's been a lot of attention on the brain, a lot of funding, and a lot of speculation as well. So I was really uncomfortable with that, and that's where every time, you know, the knowledge of the brain was exhausted, and to the best of my knowledge, to what I knew, I always went to look for inspiration in philosophy, in art, and literature, and that's I suppose how the things evolved into this book. Whereas sometimes I feel myself, well, this is really a short story. Sometimes I tell too much rather than show, because I spell things out for the benefit of making those emotions, those feelings, those dynamics clear, and perhaps in a didactic way. But that's more or less how the space...
And clearly it was your appreciation as a scientist of art's capacity to reveal truth about humanity that drew you to try to teach these lessons in the form that is generally accepted as an art form. But I think we can safely say that you weren't setting out to create Dubliners here. No.
Kirkonians maybe, but
now that you've put your toes in the water, do you see yourself maybe trying to write short stories that have a primary aesthetic ambition?
Yes, yes, I see myself. I don't know whether this happened, but truth be told, I trained as a scientist, but I've written since I was a student, and actually attended I have no formal training, but I went to one of an alumnus of your festival, Simon Van Boy. He once was running a workshop, and I attended, and it's thanks to him that I sort of learned the basics at least. And so I'd like to continue in that direction, because I think that I don't know anything anymore about the brain. All I knew it isn't there.
The more you know about the brain, the more you realise what you don't know. Right?
What I don't know.
Okay.
So, yes.
So just before I open the floor for a few questions, do you want to talk about the effect social media has on intimacy and the establishment of intimate relationships?
Well, I think it has revolutionized the way we experience intimacy. And for those who use social media, I think it has created a certain form of safety that prevent us from experiencing what a real, a contact with somebody is. And I find it something to watch, because nothing replaces a real encounter. And I talk about safety because this is a very interesting concept in psychoanalysis, I think, because it's really again about dealing with your own desire. And so these platforms allow you to defend yourself from your own desire and what it means to deal with it. I think desire is something strong for all of us. It can be anxiety-inducing, but that's why we learn over time to deal with it alone and together. And I suppose that these platforms don't help in that direction. See?
Any questions from the floor? Usually takes 10 seconds for somebody to work up the courage.
Yeah.
What effect do you think language has on a relationship?
Oh.
If the two people say don't speak the same language.
Well, specifically about whether what happens when they don't speak the same language. I think of course there'll be a lot of discovery will be difficult. I don't know much about that, but I do know. In a chapter I talk about people who've been together for 35 years and celebrate what they've learned. Over time. And I do mention language in the sense that people learn how to anticipate what they're going to say, and how that is important, how they create their own lingo at home or within a specific period of time. So language is extremely important, as I was referring earlier. Also, things we say might trigger a different reaction on the person. So.
Some languages describe things better than other languages.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yes, in the sense that in the case of two different languages, yes, this would be a challenge, and I think that would be important to learn the other person's language to understand fully what they mean. So I personally don't believe in the fact that that love is a universal language. I think that helps if you learn Chinese or whatever.
Because aside from differences in verbal language, there's also differences in body language, isn't there? And how one uses one body to communicate. I mean, one person receiving a stroke on the cheek might think, oh yeah, it's good, that person feels comfortable with me. Another person might think, oh my God, that person wants to marry me.
Yes, well, it is a culture too, right? Customs and habits that can be very deceiving.
Any other questions? Get there.
Yeah, you spoke about the mind being bigger than the brain. Have you heard anything about the discovery of neural thought receptors in both the heart and the gut?
Oh yes. So this is very much up and coming, and again, since we're all, since the entire body is a connection of things, there's no surprise that more and more discoveries in that direction will be made. So, even in Latin we say I'm disheartened, and now I think that kind of depressive state rests in the body, but in ancient Greece they thought it was really something to do with the heart, and now the microbiome is the amount of bacteria that live in our guts that can really interfere with our mental states. So I strongly believe there would be more to be revealed there, and that also what we eat is very important because there would be discrimination. I myself have never done research there, so I can't tell you more than this, but I hope we will find out more.
Our language is riddled with it, isn't it? I mean, our language is riddled with these expressions about heart and gut and these kind of feelings, and yet in our kind of scientific kind of mindset we can kind of separate and go, oh yes, well of course, but up until now we've denied it as any kind of...
Yeah, I think this rests on theories that existed, that were debunked again because of the exaggerated attention on just one organ that is the brain, but to change.
Camilla, you had a question?
I just wanted to add to that. I was reading recently that octopuses, their neurons are spread all throughout their bodies, and there's so much we don't know about octopuses, but I think we can learn a lot about ourselves from.
What's your thinking behind why people are more disenchanted now and weren't in the past?
I think it's a complicated issue, and I think that I recently read that there was a study that said that, for instance, the millennials, the very young, were less open to intimacy than the previous generation, and in this case I'm talking about they were having less sex than the previous generation. And I don't know whether it's, I think technology has something to do with it, as I said earlier, so the sense of safety that protects us from dealing with desire. And there's also a sense of fear. I don't know why it is bigger now, but in general I can tell you that one reason why we are afraid of intimacy and we may be disenchanted is that intimacy demand we be very vulnerable and truthful, so that we look for what is really within us, and that can be scary.
But if you can't answer the question, why are we more disenchanted? Can you answer the question, where's the evidence that we're actually more disenchanted now?
I'm not sure that I've got the evidence. I think it's partly his experience, not just mine, but also from people that I talk to. That they're finding it harder and harder to find a partner, for instance. So why is that? I mean, this is here. I talked to my parents.
Do you think people have too much choice?
That is certainly an issue. And choice sort of dilutes appeal, so everything becomes replaceable, becomes a commodity that can be exchanged for something else. So the worth is an inflation of choice. Yeah.
Question. It's fascinating to hear the scientific appraisal and understanding. believe in love? Is it disbelief anything to do with a sense of growing disenchantment, or does that come out from here?
Sense of belief.
You know, do people believe in love? If people don't actually have any interest in desire and belief in something, how do they believe in something and take that?
If they don't believe that, maybe they should.
I was thinking, you know, some people are very cerebral. They're just talk. And that's when I'm thinking of the brain, it's very cerebral sometimes. Shouldn't beliefs and emotions, maybe I'm coming from a different place, but are they connected with something? I've been at many festivals here now,
Right.
as a native Corkonian for the past decade of my life. I've been to the Short Story Festival, where I don't really write short stories myself, and I love the engaging ideas that I put forward. And I've been to poetry festivals, which we have in February, and a lot of it is cerebral. You know, a lot of it is very cerebral sometimes, and I'm just thinking, like, surely to go out if you're intimate with somebody, you have to desire the person, you have to want them, and that has to be a holistic decision. It has to be mind, spirit, belief, body, that's what we're at.
Yeah.
Not just the brain, that's the brain.
No, I think I understand you. I guess is that I think over time, I think you cannot really live your life cerebrally. I mean, emotions will catch up with you. Emotions guide our actions, you know, even if it's perhaps unconscious. And whether perhaps you're not interested in a relationship or experiencing fully or whatever, we also cannot live alone. So we need that connection physically, otherwise, you know, this has consequences on our sort of health. So I'm not sure that I'm addressing the belief aspect of your question, but it is.
Have we no question from the other biologist writer in the room? Yeah, I'm looking at you.
Put me on the spot. I was going to ask you if you think, as a former neuroscientist, that science can explain everything ultimately, or there are limits.
Not in my lifetime. No. I don't want to sound just pessimistic. I mean, it's fascinating. You know, we're only attracted to reading every little news that comes along, for sure. You know, perhaps to visualize it, to see it, if images are available. But I think it will be able to explain everything, and for that, we've got other forms.
So certainly, that's where belief comes in. You know, every field of success in human endeavour requires a certain amount of belief against the odds. You know, it might be the next James Joyce. You know, it might be the next Roy Keane or whatever. So I might be the next person to find true love. You know, and some people might call it magical thinking, and it goes completely against science and statistics and everything. So, like, you know, as you say, you have to look to art and poetry and fiction sometimes to get the whole truth.
Yes. So we were saying, you know, sometimes when you see images of the brain that project, you know, a particular kind of emotions or behavior, and you see a blob, you know, a red or a yellow blob, this image. I was talking about this with Pat. These are many individuals. You know, this is an average picture of several individuals who have participated in the study. So there's no context, there's no biography, there's no individuality. And how do we make up for that? So that information would perhaps, you know, be quite universal, but we need stories to fill in the detail of that.